I spent 3 days making a game in the style of Vampire Survivors for Wowie Jam 4.0. Over 1,000 games were entered, and I'm very happy with how my game was rated, landing it in the top 25%. There are definitely some elements I can improve on, most importantly, fun, but I'm proud of my game nonetheless. Well, you're here for a devlog. My name is Nuzcraft, and here's how I made Wizard Couple Survivors. Prep for the Wowie Jam started the night before when I created the GitHub repo and started thinking about what kind of game I might make. Limited by my knowledge and skills, I knew I'd be making a simple 2D game with HTML and JavaScript. It's here that I give a shout out to Jeremiah Reed and his wonderful bro-like tutorial. I've left a link in the description. I wrote down a bunch of ideas for basic mechanics that I hoped I could build out with a total jam time of 2 to 3 hours. Dodging or collecting objects for a high score isn't particularly engaging, but I was looking for broad ideas that I could implement in a very short time. Later that night, I happened across a cool video here on YouTube where a couple of developers tried to recreate Vampire Survivors in 10 lines of code in Godot. Little did I know that this would serve as inspiration for the next day. There's a link to the video in the description. Jam Day kicked off with the reveal of the Jam theme, Collaborate with AI. I immediately threw out all my ideas from yesterday and latched onto the idea of building a Vampire Survivors game with an AI companion to help. I listed out minimum requirements for the game as well as some stretch goals to shoot for after the minimum had been met. I think this was an important step for me because it allowed me to take things one step at a time and feel comfortable when I hit the threshold for my minimum viable product. Things started as they do for most everyone. I got the architecture set up to render a screen, then added a player and companion with some basic WASD movement. I pulled a bunch of boilerplate syntax, function logic, and class structures from a separate project of mine. Almost nothing was fully copy-pasted, but it was really helpful to see instances where I'd solved these problems before. Getting smooth movement was difficult, as I'd only ever made turn-based games and prototypes. After some research, I was able to find a solution that worked well enough for me. I'm using the 16-bit fantasy tile set from Oryx Design Lab, link in the description. I really like this set, as well as their other work. After movement, I focused on getting the player to shoot projectiles. This was all well and good, using effect sprites from the Oryx tile set. Eventually, the player and companion were shooting on their own on a timer that I could adjust. Additionally, the projectiles could move at variable speeds and travel for variable distance in variable directions before blinking out of existence. Next was enemies. Enemies were set to spawn away from the player and companion and move slowly toward whichever was closer. There's no fancy pathfinding, just a straight line to the closest enemy. With enemies chasing the player down, we had need for collisions, lose conditions, scores, and an easy way to restart. This was bringing us closer to an actual game. The final feature added on day 1 was the companion AI. It's remarkably simple and is driven by 2 rules. 1, get away from enemies. 2, stay close to the player. Each frame, the companion finds enemies that are too close and calculates which direction to go to get away from them on average. If the player is too far away, that'll get included in the calculation as well. In my opinion, the companion danger zone is a little too big. It'll run away from enemies before they're really close enough for them to get hit with projectiles. At the end of day 1, there were only 3 needs missing from our game: stored high scores, screen shake, and sounds. I'd spent about 4 hours developing the game so far, which was more than I'd expected to be able to spend the entire weekend. The first thing I worked on day 2 was high scores. I decided to score the player and companion separately and combine the scores for the total high score. Most of the logic was pulled from Jeremiah Reed's bro-like tutorial, altered to make sense for the kinds of scores I was storing. Screen shake went in as a quick feature, and all of a sudden I was only 1 feature away from my minimum viable product. Was it now time to work on sounds? No. Instead, I started pulling from my wish list by working on player progression. Up to this point, the game could have been called done, but it was frightfully difficult to lose. Player progression made it so that the player fired different kinds of projectiles as they gained score, basically as a level-up system to help them deal with higher volumes of enemies. Both the player and companion would eventually transition through 5 different levels of projectiles, each expanding the previous one's ability to take out monsters. This took the majority of day 2. I knew that this progression had the opportunity to feel good for the player, and I wasn't too concerned with the state of the game since we'd gotten so many features in already. I spent about 2 hours developing on day 2, virtually all of it while watching Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. On the final day, I wanted to wrap up a few things and get the game posted to itch.io. The first thing was enemy progression. I started by adding new enemy types. In addition to the basic slow enemy, I added a fast one and a tanky one. The fast one would serve as a challenge to make sure the players were moving around, and the tanky one would add to the chaos toward the end of the run. It was only here on day 3 that I updated my sprites to actually match the theme of the game, swapping the knight and rogue sprites with red and purple wizards, and changing the slow enemy to a zombie. Enemy progression was finalized similar to player progression, everything scaling off the player's score, with higher scores equating to more fast and tanky enemies, in addition to a higher total volume of enemies. Next, I work on adding a background. This included drawing a tile plus a semi-random overlay to each section of the screen. I also made it so that when monsters die, bones appear on the background tile beneath them. Since the player kills a lot of enemies, I figured this would equate to the screen filling up with bones. Next, I added effects like explosions that would be rendered to the screen when enemies were hit with projectiles. This, with screen shake, adds a lot of impact to the player landing shots, and I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. Getting them to animate as expected was a bit of a pain for some reason, but it worked out and it looks great. Finally, towards the end of day 3, I checked off the final box of my minimum viable product with sounds from SFXR, link in the description. I only included sounds for shooting a projectile and for an explosion. Ideally, I'd have added background music, but I didn't have time or energy for that. The final pieces I added before submitting, player spawning in a random location, and the letters WASD on the screen around the player when a game is started. I'm not really pumped about this hacky way of showing the controls in-game, but it was getting late and the second half of the 2 towers had already finished. I was ready for bed. I zipped everything up, slapped together an itch page, submitted to the jam, and went to bed. I'd spent almost 3 hours developing. I don't remember when I landed on calling the game Wizard Couple Survivors, but it was sometime during this last development stretch. There's a link to the game as well as the source code in the description. Please go play it. In conclusion, I'm really happy with how things went on this project. I learned a lot about being okay with spaghetti code when it serves a purpose. Taking the easy and obvious route to solve most problems was indeed correct most of the time over this weekend. I made a list, followed the list in small, easy steps, and the result was better than I expected. Feedback on the game was generally positive, which was a confidence booster. A few things mentioned that I would have liked to do better. First, a scared companion. The companion runs away from enemies before it really has a chance to hit them with a projectile. Reducing the radius it scans for enemies to run away might have helped the companion feel more involved, but it might have also gotten it killed more often, which would have frustrated the player. Bounding the map in some way would have been beneficial, because in our jam version, the player and companion can just leave the visible area to avoid enemies forever. I would have liked to have had a large bounded area with a moving camera. And then finally, enemy and player progression. Eventually, you just lose because your projectiles can't keep up, and you can't see yourself dodging outside the camera view. Better tuned player and enemy progression could have made the game more fun. And that's going to be it. This is how I made Wizard Couple Survivors for Wowie Jam 4.0. Total development time was around 9 to 10 hours, spread over 3 days. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this or found it interesting. Thanks.